Hey, we're just about to start a special episode, which is a crossover episode between myself and the Welsh American Channel, a YouTube channel I recommend you go check out if you're a Welsh American. You might find it very interesting. He talks about culture and events and history. And so, if you want a very detailed understanding of the settlement of America by Welsh populations, definitely someone to check out. This is a great conversation. We end up talking a lot, and I give a lot of background of my personal life and my personal history. So, in case you have missed some of that or don't know everything that I've talked about in the past about it, this is a great one to sort of gather that information, as well as talking about the creation of the podcast, kind of what motivated it, and what we're doing in the future. So, with all that said and done, I hope you'll check it out. A lot of fun, great discussion, and check out his channel. Links below in the description for those of you checking those out. With all that said, let's get to the episode.
Greetings, this is Greg Thomas, and welcome to the Welsh American Channel. As our subscribers know, we publish most of our videos about Welsh American history, but occasionally we do like to interview influencers who promote Welsh identity. And we have such an influencer today. I am pleased and delighted to have Jonathan Williams as our guest. Jonathan is the founder and content creator of the Welsh History Podcast. And I've been a follower of his on Spotify for years, working out in my yard in the greenhouse. I usually don't like to look at a screen. I like to just listen to podcasts all day long, and his Spotify version is really awesome. But yet you can also find his excellent podcast on YouTube at youtube.com at Welsh History Podcast. So, Jonathan, what can I say? Croeso, welcome to the Welsh American Channel.
Thank you. I often say Croeso, of course, as well. So it threw me for a second. I was like, what do I say? But yeah, thank you.
You do open a lot of your podcasts with
I do.
Welcome in Welsh, and that's great. I usually close mine with a statement in Welsh, so that's good. And it's probably good that some Americans learn at least a few Welsh words, even though, as you've said on your own podcast, if you're an English speaker, it is a very difficult language to learn. It takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I really don't think people understand sometimes when you grow up around something, how difficult it can be. Hey, I grew up in Canada. We had French from the time I was in grade school. It's on all of our packaging. I still don't know how to speak French. So, I know more Spanish than I know French. I'm going to put it that way. So I try to explain that. It's like, if I can't speak that, you think I'm going to have an easy time with Welsh. You're crazy.
Well, let's talk about Welsh. When did you first sense your Welshness? I just find it so interesting. I've talked to thousands upon thousands of people here in North America who, my grandmother was Welsh, or my great-grandfather was Welsh. And they may have names like Jenkins or Williams or Thomas or Jones or on and on and on. And probably 99% of them don't care. They may have Welsh lineage, but they don't have a sense of their Welshness or a love of Welsh culture. So how did this come upon you, being a Canadian? I believe you were born in Canada as well. Mm-hmm. So how did all of this Welshness come upon you? What's your story?
So I am a second-generation Canadian. My grandparents were born in Wales. They lived there until they were in their mid-20s. They moved to Canada in 1929. And my father was born, as my grandfather apparently used to tell him, 9 months later. Because of that, I was around the accent, not the language, but the accent growing up. Okay. Didn't really know that, though, I'll be fair. But when I started to learn about Welsh people, and specifically Wales as a place, I started to get a bit curious. But I was really young when it first kind of hit that it was, it's not England. It's not this, it's not that.
Right.
And so I remember when I was probably 10 or 11, I went to my grandfather, who still had a very North Walian accent, still had the rolling R's and all that. My grandmother was even worse. And, cause when they would talk, it'd be, come to your grandfather. And, so I grew up around that, but then like I was bothering him one day, and I'm sure it was me bothering him. And I asked him, how do you say my name in Welsh? And he just went, Jonathan. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Not realizing he just said it with a slightly more Welsh accent.
Sure,
and and years later, it's argumentative as to whether it's actually Sean in Welsh, but realistically, it might not even be. It might actually just be Jonathan, because it's specifically the Hebrew version of the name.
Right.
But yeah, so that was kind of where my first real introduction to it was. I didn't really grow up with Welsh because my grandfather, God love him, didn't like his ancestry. And when he left Wales, he made a very purposeful decision never to speak Welsh again.
Wow.
And he never, ever talked about it. Like, I would ask him stuff and I never heard a word. Now, my grandmother may have, but my grandmother died when I was 8. So I didn't really know her that well. And they only were around us for a short time before she passed away, in fact, when I was a little kid. And so I didn't really get a chance, because she was the one who still had connections, still had family she talked to. But my grandfather, he wiped the didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to know about it. And there's reasons historically, which, I mean, I don't know how far you want me to go into, but for why he was like that. But yeah, he didn't. The only time my father said he ever spoke Welsh was he called him a name when he was growing up, like a nickname, which was Hen Mocha and Fowl, which that's how my father pronounced it. I learned later that his translation of it is wrong, or at least his understanding of it is wrong, because he always used to say it was dirty little pig. And it is pig, but it's more like old pig. So I'm not quite sure where he's got the idea that it's, but that was his idea of what his nickname was. And then he would speak Welsh when family came over. And that was it.
Oh.
So my father didn't go to Wales at all, ever. Was never really bothered one way or another about it. He was proud of it, but just sort of in a slightly proud of it kind of way, I guess. He knew that they didn't like the English. That was the only thing he really understood. And beyond that, he didn't really clearly understand it well enough. Mm-hmm. So neither of them gave enough of a care that I didn't know a single word in Welsh until I was 16. Okay. And didn't have any clue. So what ended up happening was my mother was doing family history. I started to look at the family history she was doing, saw all the weird words, and started to question, why are these words being used here? What is all this? And that was sort of the trigger. And then when I was living in Toronto as a teenager, I used to go, they had a reference library, and that's where I was introduced to the Welsh language. I was introduced to Welsh history and started to get into it because of that. That literally was it. And up until then, I didn't know anything about it. Much like you said, a lot of people have come over. And to be fair, I think this is a common experience for a lot of people. They just don't talk about it. Like my mother's parents and ancestors didn't really speak about where they'd come from. So it just was that way. Like most of it, you kind of find out through family stories. But even at that, my grandparents did not talk about anything to do with family history. So I knew very, very little of it. And it's only been going back through it. I ended up living in Britain for a while. Sorry, I'm tangenting here as I often do. But,
okay.
When I was there, I went up and met some of my cousins and my aunt. And in talking to them, I learned more about my family in Wales than I did before that, because they actually knew about it. They talked about it. Because the only thing I knew is when my great-grandfather passed away, my father and my grandmother went back to Wales for the funeral. And that was the only thing I knew before that. And I ended up finding a passenger list where it actually had them going over, because the other side to that is that they talked about it like my dad had been there for a year or two, because this is in the 30s. So you only got over there by passenger ship. So there was kind of this idea that he must have been there a while, but he wasn't. He was there like less than 4 months, I think. But the way they talked about it was like, oh, it was a long time. He spoke Welsh when he got back, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, actually, he was there a couple of months. So maybe not so much.
Yeah.
But my aunt talked about when he was there and him running around and blah, blah, blah. Now she's my great aunt, I should say. But yeah, it was an interesting education into the Welsh side of my family because up until then I really didn't know much about it. And that is, I mean, that was what triggered a lot of my interest in Wales. And I think it's kind of ironic from my grandfather's probably point of view, if he really knew that I'd end up going back and living there and still hold
Sure.
affinity to the place that he kind of wiped his feet off of. So, you know.
My personal story is even a little bit more bizarre. So my grandfather, Thomas, middle name was John, came to the United States in 1897, left Treorchy, which is in South Wales, a coal mining village, real tough area of Wales.
Mhm.
And he passed before I was even born, so I never even met the man. And to complicate it even further, my parents were divorced when I was a young child, and
Oh, wow.
cut off from my father's side of the family. So I really have had no Welsh connection as far as father, grandfather, going further back. And yet, in spite of all that, I have always, since I was a small child, had a deep love of Wales and a profound sense of Welshness, even though I can't put my finger exactly on what experience or individual sparked that desire within me. So,
Yeah.
some people are just attracted to the history and the love of Welsh culture and Welsh people. And you're one, and I'm one, and that's
Yep.
why we're here on this broadcast this evening. I know that you are a Canadian, but yet
Mhm.
you have lived in Wales. If I recall correctly from one of your podcasts, it was around 1999. Could you tell us a little bit why you relocated to Wales and what some of your experiences were there?
Sure. So yeah, it was 1999 was the first time. I've actually been over there twice. And in 1999 in where I was living at the time, which actually is the place I'm living in currently, which is Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Okay.
The economy was pretty poor at the time and employment was really bad. And so I wasn't very happy. And I was talking to a few people about that and
Mhm.
was looking at moving, but I didn't want to live somewhere where we were because it wasn't any bigger improvement.
Okay.
So I started to kind of look overseas and all of that, and what triggered it is the fact. So if you are a Commonwealth citizen, there's a very specific visa you have access to, which is called an ancestry visa.
Hmm.
So you're only eligible for it if your grandparent, at least one of them, was born in the UK.
Ah, okay.
So you can go over. You are not allowed to rely on any public funding, with the exception of the NHS, the National Health Service, if your
Hmm.
viewers don't know. And but everything else you have to pay for. So if you have any sort of, like, if you get unemployed, tough on you, you're dealing with it on your own for 5 years. And at
Okay.
the end of 5 years, you can then apply for further full status and then eventually citizenship if you want.
Right. Okay.
So I went over with that in mind, and I went over first. My wife at the time, well, my still wife, and our two kids stayed back in Canada, and then I went over first to get a job. And then once I got a job, they joined me, but it was several months later. And it was kind of inverse of what my family did, in fact, in a way.
Hmm.
And so they joined me at the end of 1999, and we were living in Bristol. But we found a rental in Cardiff, which was really inexpensive, and so we moved up there. And that was where I wanted to be anyway, because I didn't want to be in England. I wanted to be in Wales. So that was, and then within like a week or two after that, I got my job that I had for the rest of the time I was there. So yeah, so I lived in Cardiff for basically 4 years, and on that visa. And then as the visa was expiring at the time, my wife and I made the decision to move back for various reasons, not least of which the fact that we'd had child number 3, but child number 3 turned into 3 and 4.
Okay.
And all of a sudden everything got very small in Britain. And so we thought about moving back, and we had a long conversation about it. And so then we ended up moving back rather than extending our stay or going, and for a lot of reasons moved back to Canada. And then there was a point where I went back for 6 months to try again, but that was at a bad point in time in British employment. So it was the inverse of what I went through in Alberta. And so I've been in Alberta ever since. And then coming up soon, I've just actually got my visa back. So I'm thinking of heading back to Wales before the end of the year. So we'll see what that leads to, but that's kind of the plan at the minute.
Yeah, well, great. Actually, I will be in October. I will be in Llandudno for 14 days with my wife. We were actually there a couple of years ago. Yeah, it's a beautiful seaside resort in North Wales. So we're looking forward to that. So as a Canadian, what was your first impressions of Wales, and how would you compare the standard of living in Cardiff with what your experience was in Canada?
The way I would describe it pretty frequently, because it's hard to explain to people from North America because they look at it from North American standards.
Right.
And you sort of have to picture it. So when you talk about living expenses or like your day to day, right, it's going to seem worse than it is because earning money in pounds is different than earning money in dollars.
Sure.
And so people are like going 1 to 1 and you're like, no, think double, especially in Canadian dollars. So it's like, oh, that salary is actually not bad. So for us, in that era, especially, it was good. The only problem we really ran into there is once you start to have over 2 kids, it becomes quite a difficult process. Because there isn't really a lot made for families that, at least at that time, that had more than 2 children, from busing to all sorts of different things to, family activities. A family pass was only 2 kids, which nowadays would be more common. But back then, that, at least for us, that was much more awkward. And, that was a big difference. I think the biggest thing for me, it's never the things that you think it's going to be. When you go overseas and your experience is what it is, all the usual things stick out initially, right? For the first couple of months, you're like, oh my gosh, trying to get used to the time, trying to get used to the fact that it's not 911, it's 999, it's blah, 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 blah. All these different little things that you kind of notice the first minute, right? From the minute you get change in your hand to everything else, right?
Right.
But what really stood out to me was later when you're sitting there and you're thinking, gosh, I would just like some peanut butter. Or, gosh, I would just like this, like sour cream. They don't know what that is. And it comes in very small yogurt-sized cups and blah, blah. So, like, making a taco, for example, was very awkward because you couldn't find easy stuff. You had to go to, like, the U.S. shop to find stuff. And, of course, my favorite thing with Britain, and I used to make fun of it all the time, is the idea of American style. Because everything over there, if they want to label it as American, it's American style soda or American style this and donuts and that. And I'm like, these are the least American style anything I've ever seen. But so it's kind of that way. So you kind of adapt and you learn, there's little things that stick out really quite a lot when you think about it. And I always talk to my kids about it after the fact because some of them were never living there, so they don't know. And I'm trying to explain. But, Wales is a whole different. The biggest thing I would say about the people as opposed to the items is that the people are so much more open and friendly than the people I live around now. That's not a criticism of Canadians, but it's just the fact that generally, I think in part because of the weather, we're a little more closed. We're a little bit more standoffish. And I know a lot of people who come to Canada would argue the opposite. But I think we're different with strangers than we are with our friends and neighbors, right? And in Wales, you could walk on a bus, and the minute they heard your accent, it was 15 questions about where you come from, what are you doing here, blah, 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 And that was such a different experience, and I had a real hard time with it because it was like, but my wife got along great because she's very chatty, so she was very happy to go into the conversation. But yeah, it was something that I had to get used to, which I quite appreciate now, but at the time it was a little rough initially. But it's such a different experience that you can't really describe unless you've been there. But at the same time, it's so understandable because we're all human beings. Like you think of the fact that I used to work in a building which was not far away from Cardiff Castle, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I always tell my kids, it's so funny because you're there and here's a castle that's been a castle for nearly 1,000 years. Before that, it was a Roman fort for another 500 years before that. And all of this history that's around you. And you walk up and you say, oh, have you been to the castle? And 99% of the people say, no, I've never been there. Why would I go there? And you're just like, what?
Yeah.
Is it just to them? It's normal. But to me, it's like, wow, this is so cool.
Sure.
It used to drive me crazy, and I've said this on my podcast that the 1800s archaeologists slash crazy people used to go around and build follies on top of sites because they're like, oh well, we have this idea of what things were. So
Sure.
very very famously, there's a castle that's been rebuilt called Castle Coch in
Mm-hmm.
Cardiff.
Yes.
And it is a complete folly. It's been built by the Marquis of Bute in the 1800s on top of a Roman lookout. So he's effectively, in my opinion, wrecked what was there to build this, fake castle.
Right.
Other people are like, oh, it's so beautiful and there's so many neat things in it. And I'm just like, he ruined stuff. I don't know.
So I assume, did you start the Welsh History podcast after you came back from Wales? So what inspired you to start or to begin the Welsh History podcast?
My reason for starting the podcast, which it's a very simple one. There wasn't one. At the time I started it, which was in 2016, there was nothing. There was a series of episodes that the BBC had put in a podcast format of like 10 episodes that talked about Welsh history, and that was it. And at the time I was listening, as I still do today, to the British History podcast, and he was just never mentioning the Welsh history that much. And I got kind of frustrated with it because I'm like, this is annoying. I want to know more about Welsh history. I'm not as fussed. I mean, I like learning about the rest of it, but it'd be nice if we do more on it. But I get there's a lot more. Not understanding fully that part of the reason why I wasn't doing more was because there just wasn't more, but I found that out later. And so I started to kind of look into it, and I started asking people I knew, because one of the things I did was I was on a group on Facebook which does talk about history podcasts, and they're both fans and podcasters, so they'll advertise and do all sorts of different things and just talk about generally, oh, so-and-so's put out a new podcast, and everybody gets excited. Like Mike Duncan is very popular on that feed, so everybody gets very excited whenever he puts out a new podcast. And so I was talking to some of them, and I said, man, I would really like a Welsh history podcast. They're like, well, why don't you start one? I was like, oh, I guess I could. And I didn't really want to, I'll be honest with you. But I was like, you know what? Heck with it. I'm going to do it. So I sat down. I kind of, I'm a historian by education. And I did my history in Victorian / 1800s antebellum United States. And then post antebellum periods, post Civil War period, for those who may or may not understand that phrasing. Kind of that was where I was going with my degree, and then kind of got frustrated because things weren't going the way I wanted them to. And so that was part of the reason why I was like, I would like to do the podcast for a couple of different reasons. One, because there isn't one, but two, because for me, the biggest frustration I have is that I'm a frustrated history professor that didn't get to be his history professor. So this is a way to continue to be a history professor without doing it. And so that was kind of the start of it. But my goal always had been to create a podcast that was something that anybody could listen to and understand what it was about. You didn't have to start with a base understanding of anything. So I started from the start and kind of have gone progressively forward after that. But yeah, I started in 2016 in the late fall or late spring of 2016, and it's been going ever since. And every time I think I'm done, I find more reason to keep going.
So that's like 247 episodes, plus you have additional insert episodes.
Yep.
Remarkable. That's like 9 years you have stuck with this project of yours when, there are probably tens of thousands of podcasters who start a podcast and quit within a month.
I'm one of them.
How much work it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And yet 9 years and 240 whatever episodes later, you're still at it. That is rather remarkable. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a bit surprising. I will be honest. I will say this, that I think if it was, so I've been on other podcasts, I've started other podcasts, so I've been involved with the different ones. And I think if it had kind of hit that way, I don't think I would have kept going. I would have been like everybody else and just quit, because I've been like, okay, that's enough of that. Mm-hmm. But almost immediately, like within 2 months of starting it, I found out I had a group of people that were listening. And then it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. And now over that, now I don't know where the numbers are currently, but I know last year or the year, maybe it was almost a year before, we passed 500,000 downloads.
Wow.
And yeah, so I mean, it's just exploded in a way I never imagined when I started it, and like nothing else I've ever done before with this. So it's been very, very, I almost feel a bit bad about considering stopping, because I'm like, no, there's still more stuff I could cover. There's more things I can do. So I think there's still something here I can work from, but I am still trying to, like most recently in one of the other episodes you're talking about, is I restarted and went back and I started from the Iron Age, basically, because I was like, okay, I listened to the podcasts that I did at the beginning. I didn't love them. It's not that they're bad. If you listen to them, it's fine. But I wanted to do more with it, because I was doing it sort of on the fly without my research understanding that I have now, and there was a lot of things that had changed over the last 8-9 years. And so I thought, well, I'll do a series just on this. I won't make it a long-term series, but it's a little 10-episode series. So if you want to dive back in with a lot more context and a lot more understanding of what's going on, bam, there you go. And then I'm starting soon a Roman Britain podcast, which will be sort of the similar idea. It will go back in depth on that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it. Those are kind of the things where it's like, this is a bugaboo of mine. I want to go back into it. I'm trying to avoid getting really deep into some of the stuff that I would probably love to do more of until I'm in Britain, because I feel like I can't do a good enough job of it here. You know, one of the things that's most difficult to explain is it's really, really hard and expensive to get research from Britain, and especially Welsh research. And I don't speak Welsh. So if I'm trying to read something from like the 1300s, it's all written in Old Welsh. That ain't going to fly. Right. But I don't have, 4 people around me all speak Welsh that can read it and tell me what it says. So that's one of the reasons why I want to go back, is to spend more time on that and to actually put in a better effort on some of it, because that's a concern of mine. Also from the aspect of, I'd like to do more documentary style videos. Mm-hmm. And so that's something I've been excited to do, that kind of thing. So for me, that's been a big part of the reason why I wanted to go back and revisit stuff. And originally, when I started the podcast, to be perfectly frank, I was going to end at the end of independence. Yeah. Originally, that was the goal, just to get to the end of independence, because I was burned out and I was going, oh my goodness, I need to stop. And I took a summer off, which you won't notice if you're listening to it with it, after COVID. But before COVID, in 2019, I did take a break for the summer just because I was so stressed out, because I was doing a bunch of stuff at the time. I was live streaming, doing another thing. I was doing another podcast and and it was just all building, and I'd had enough. And so I took a summer off to just kind of recharge, and came back and went, nope, we're going to keep going. So, because like for me, initially I kind of thought the end of independence is a good break point, or I could end it at the end of Owen Glyndŵr, which is again another period of independence. Right. I thought those would be 2 good cutoff points, because I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it once I got there. Mm-hmm. And then I started to think about it, and the more I thought about it, the more, like I say, as listenership went up, I kind of said, okay, I think this is worth continuing, because there's not enough coverage. And of course, that's changed over time. Now there's a lot more websites and videos and various other things that are out there that if people wanted to go and listen to or watch, they can definitely do that. But when you're the only voice in the wilderness for such a long time, it's like, well, if I stop, what happens? And I've been reached out to in the past by schools in Britain, who, especially some in Wales, who've talked
Yeah,
about that they use the podcast. So I'm like, okay, well, that's not making me feel very nervous. Uh, you know,
sure,
and there's loads of people that have picked it up during the pandemic, which also kind of reinforced,
sure.
because I had loads of people reach out and say, "Oh, I've been binging your episodes," and they're like, "Oh, I was at like episode 5, now I'm at episode 100." I'm like, "Oh my gosh!"
Wow. So
So,
the hardest part of being a content creator? What's the biggest struggle? Is it research, editing, just writing? What is the most difficult part for you?
um, it depends on the day. Editing is not so bad now because I've got a rhythm of how I do it. Like I
Mhm.
used to make a lot more not more effort, but it was a lot more awkward to do because I was
Right.
constantly editing out stuff. One of the biggest things I was able to do is get a microphone and a setup that I can nix
Mhm.
a lot of things that used to bother me about my voice
Yeah.
and kind of make it sound better. And like if you listen to the earlier stuff versus the later stuff, there's a big difference in quality. And that's in part because of the changing setup.
Right.
And as well, it made the editing a lot easier. The other thing is now is my process is to go in, I record the whole thing because it's a video edit. I can't really go in and when I used to do just audio format, I would actually edit while I was doing it. So I would read, and if I
Wow.
fumbled, I would actually just cut that and go back and start again
Wow.
from the point I fumbled at
Yeah.
and then
Okay.
keep going because I was like, well, this will just make it easier because it'll be edited right as I'm doing it. So it'll be done. Right. But what I was missing was there was stuff I wasn't hearing or seeing at the time that I would make mistakes on and catch later. But by then it was too late because it was already published. But so doing the video format actually has made it a bit better because I have to go back in and watch the whole thing again. But of course,
Sure.
it
Right.
doubles the length of time that you're doing it because for every minute of recording, it's usually at least double and sometimes triple or quadruple, depending on the episode that you're editing. So that part it's an inconvenience. It's the part that's most difficult to do.
Mhm.
Uh, but for me, the longest chore really has always been the research and the writing. And I put them hand in hand because you can't really do one without the other.
Mhm.
And the reality of it is it's gotten easier in the last few years than it has been for a very long time because previously I was very restricted on sourcing
Mhm.
and trying to get enough sources, like typically without going too deep in the weeds. If I'm talking about a specific subject, let's say the Tudors, for example, right? This is a bad example, but it is an example.
Okay.
Um, I would get like 2 or 3 books, right? I would have one that was sort of the main discussion. It was an overview type thing. It would be it would go from the beginning of Henry VII to the end of Elizabeth I, and it would talk about all the high points, right? And then
Mhm.
you would get a couple of books that would be a little bit more in depth. Might be one that just talks about the women of the Tudors and their life. Another book that might be the early life of Henry VII and his trials before he becomes king.
Mhm.
And that would be it because I couldn't afford any more than that. Anything beyond that was just way too expensive and it just became, very difficult. Now, the Tudors, there's lots of it, so it's a little different. But if you're going back on subjects like Owen Glyndŵr, where the only sources are from Wales, and your only subject matter and subject information is Welsh, then it's a lot different and your sourcing is a lot more awkward to get to. One of the biggest boons to me has been that the University of Wales Press has a website and you
Mhm.
can just go through and find topics through there. And quite often, if I'm struggling to find something, they'll have it. And most of the time it's okay price wise. Some of it can be really expensive because it's academic and academic books are hideous. But and then translate that into Canadian dollars. And then the
Mhm.
shipping costs, and it's like, oh my goodness. So like a 40-pound book is like 120 pounds or dollars for me. And so when I talk on my podcast about how happy I am that people are helping me with this, that's the reason. And so as the internet has gotten better at storing information, as more and more people have gotten involved in Welsh history and digitalizing it, especially like National Library has amazing amounts of digitalized stuff now. You can do a lot of research without having to spend money. So that's a huge benefit.
Mhm.
And quite frequently, you rely on other sources that are not necessarily always the best, like Wikipedia. when you have a subject, but you never rely on them for the actual writing. You rely on them for, okay, where is this coming from? And then you start down the path of, okay, what's this topic or what's that topic? And we're like pirates in Wales. I knew there was a lot. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they were exactly, but I knew, when you have Roberts, when you have Jones, when you have Davies, there's a lot. And so you're like, okay, how do I find them? So then again, you go back to Wikipedia. It says, here's the list. And here's some sources. And then you start looking at the sources, and typically their sources come from like the early 1900s. And so then you can at least start to go, okay, well, where is this? And then you sort to research out. So all of that takes time. And so for me, it's like, I've had people trying to they're like, oh, how can we predict, or no, what's the word I want to use? So like, if I'm trying to sell something on the podcast, which I don't do very often, but if I was to do that, sometimes when I'm asked about this, they'll go, well, what's your themes for this week or that week? I'm like, dude, I'm barely at this week. I don't know about next week. We'll see.
Yeah. So what's the biggest lesson learned as being a content creator and creating a podcast? What strikes you as, wow, looking back on my experience, the best thing or the biggest thing I learned was
that you never really understand what will trigger or interest someone until it does. I mean, you get into these things, and I didn't get into the Welsh History podcast to suddenly get popular. Not that I'm popular, but you know what I mean. Not to become famous or to become super big. It was just like a passion project that I started on a whim.
Sure.
And so for me, that's the biggest lesson I think I've learned, is just how much it's educated me. Not so much everybody else, because I'm sure people have, but I can't make that judgment. But for me, I've learned stuff that I didn't have any clue about, and stuff that I'm still learning, and the significance of things that I never really even considered, even in my own country, and never really kind of quantified or qualified when I look at Wales. Like, you look at the history of Wales, we all know sort of the mythological stuff. If you've studied any of the history, we all know the King Arthurs, we all know the Merlins and the nonsensical stuff that's out there, but we also know about a few historical names, right? And most of them are old, because that's mostly what people know unless you're living in Britain. Like Aneurin Bevan's doesn't mean anything to anybody unless you're in Britain. And most people won't know who that is. He's basically the founder of the NHS, National Health Service, and major role in the Labour Party at the time. But he's one of these people that if I didn't see his statue in Cardiff, I wouldn't have known who he was. And it was just from reading his statue that I was like, oh, okay. And then just went on my way. And then later on, the name kept cropping up. And I'm like, oh, okay. I haven't covered him in the podcast yet. He will probably get his own dedicated episode just to him, possibly more. And so those are the kind of things where it's like, these are things that I didn't really think about or look at or consider. Like, I didn't really, like, when I wasn't thinking of ever going farther than the 1500s, it surprised me how much more stuff comes and has been there that you don't really even realize until you're doing it. And then you're like, oh, actually, there is a lot going on here that we don't think about. There's a lot happening. Like, I could have never told you until I started doing the research, and this is going to come out in an episode. Well, it came out in an episode a while back, but it's going to come out again in the next episode I'm publishing, is how influential Lloyd George was in some of the initial nationalist movements in Wales.
Sure.
And that's just not a name I would have associated with it, because I only ever associated him with World War I before that, right? Because that's all I ever really heard about him. And now all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, he was actually a big youth movement guy in the politics of Wales at a time when Wales was starting to see a lot of nationalism cropping up for the first time in probably 200 years, maybe. And it's not the part that most people know, because all they really know is, oh, he was the Prime Minister of Britain. And yes, but then there's all this other stuff. And it's really, really interesting and fascinating. And it's kind of, the other thing is, I actually learned, if I was to point out to one thing that personally meant something to me, it's actually that I learned why my grandfather hates Wales so much. because so I wasn't going to go into this, but I think I should, because I think I should
Okay.
give some context.
Sure.
So my grandfather's father owned a pub in North Wales. And at some point in the pub, there was an argument between him and another gentleman. They fought. My great-grandfather was killed in the fight. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so my great-grandmother had a bunch of small children and no income. So I don't know how all of it occurred, but effectively what ends up happening is she ended up in one of the workhouses, which, if you don't know what that is, it's not a great place. It's basically social housing in a Victorian style. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, and you kind of got a good idea what they are. And she was in Pwllheli, and the workhouse there was so notorious, it made it actually made there was a report done on it in 1911 that made it into the Parliament because of how bad it was. And my grandfather, who was just a young boy when they went in there, him and his brother, effectively what ends up happening when they go in there at the time, the mentality of the day was, well, it's your fault you're poor, right? And so they're like, we can't have this filthy poor attitude going on to the young children. So they split you from your children, and then they farmed the children out to learn how to work. And so my grandfather was sent on to a farm where he worked, and as it turned out, eventually met his wife, my grandmother. And, and he was separated away from his family because of it. And so he was very, very mad at his mother because he thought it was his mother that was the cause of all this.
Okay.
And so he always held it against her. And because of that, that was why he didn't want to go back to Wales. Didn't want to talk about Wales. Didn't want anything to do with it because for him, it was a bad memory. And it totally makes sense. But at the same time, I'm sitting here and I'm reading this stuff because I'm starting to look into this kind of stuff. And I ended up getting a book which talks about it specifically because I found it was actually accidentally finding this segment on the workhouse in the, we call it Hansard. I'm not sure if that's what they call it there, but basically the reports from the Parliament talking about it and how bad it was and how notorious it was in the area. And I'm like, yeah, that then makes a lot of sense that basically they didn't care. They were very unfeeling about what they did. And the workhouses, funny enough, they survive until the 50s. So in a way, they still existed. They changed dramatically as time goes on, but they were something they were using from about, I think, 1840 until 1950s. And for different reasons at different times, they meant different things. But it was always initially about, well, we need somewhere to deal with the very poor people who can't afford to live somewhere. And so that was their solution. But they were underfunded. They were generally very poorly kept up. Most of the time, the people in charge of them were there unwillingly. And so it was just not a fun place to be. So when you see those kind of things and you understand, and it's like, here's a child who's like 5 years old having to understand what this means, you can understand why that wouldn't go well. And that's kind of the solution. So my biggest education came out of that research that I had to do, which was just basically a hole I started digging down because of something else. And it was fascinating to kind of dig down that because, like I say, my grandmother's side, it was all really nice and fun and blah, 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 blah. But yeah, his side was a mess.
Yeah, we've had this conversation because I think it'll help our viewers to appreciate the amount of research that it takes just to create one podcast or one short video. It is a phenomenal amount of research to make sure that you accurately put together information. So I
absolutely
think help people to appreciate that. So tell me, what's the future of the Welsh History Podcast? What's the future look like?
So my initial, after I changed my mind on when the cutoff date is, my sequential cutoff date becomes the establishment of the Senate. So 1999, 98, I can't remember exactly when the assembly gets founded. Because to me, that's, once you get past that, it's no longer history, it's news. And so
in honor of the first time you went to Wales, 1999?
Yeah. So it was just established right around then. Yeah. In
Okay.
fact, it was funny because I was thinking about it even like a year before. In fact, the year prior, I thought about going over. I wasn't really sure, and I ended up making contact with a professor who worked at the University of Aberystwyth.
Hmm.
And so we were talking about the vote in 97 and how influential that was and how excited they were about what that meant. And so it really got me excited. And it was actually one of the reasons why I went over. So yeah, 99 was an interesting year to go over and kind of experience that. One of the funniest parts, so as an aside, is as a Commonwealth citizen, one thing you can do that nobody else can do other than British people is you can vote in their elections if you live there.
Oh, whoa,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's very weird. I found it very strange. And I always used to tell my British friends, it's like, you can't vote in my election. I don't understand why this imperial holdover is still there, but yeah. So yeah, we were over there, and the first year we were over there, second year. It was the second year we were there, was the first national election since Tony Blair had been elected the first time.
Mm.
And then right after that, I think was the second assembly elections, right? So we were very much involved in that. And I can remember I said to my friends, I said, I have no idea who I'm voting for. I don't know anything. So I was like trying to get educated because I hate voting without idea.
Yeah.
But I wanted to vote because, I was living there and paying taxes. You're darn right. I wanted to have a say. And the candidate I voted for didn't win, which is fine. But it was interesting and quite educational and very different than my experience both in the United States and Canada, because even though Canada has a very similar system, the way elections are run are so different. It's hard to explain how different they are. And it was very, very interesting to kind of see that side of it. So for me, that was very cool. And yeah, being around for that early days stuff, I never realized how it would go. And I've said this on my podcast. I actually really appreciate the fact that they call it the Senate rather than the Assembly. I know that in English they'll say Welsh Parliament, but nobody calls it that typically. I always hear Senate, which to me it sounds better.
Mm-hmm.
It's just saying the Welsh Senate basically, but because it's the Welsh name, it kind of works. It's what it was called during Owen Glyndwr's time, and I always have a soft spot for Owen Glyndwr, so that for me is going to be another reason. In fact, named one of my kids after him, so yeah.
Okay. And it sounds a lot more authoritative than Assembly.
Yeah. Assembly always sounded like we have an assembly here in where I live, and it always sounds like a subnational thing, and Wales is very proud of saying they're a nation, not a subnation, a state or a province. And, as someone coming from Canada who's been near the United States and followed it quite frequently, I used to snicker under my hand sometimes and say, well, you're not really a nation, but I don't want to go there. But, over the years, I've come to appreciate what they mean by that. And I think having it being called the Senate, even the Parliament, I think it's better. It's more like what it is, because it's not supposed to be subservient. It's supposed to be co-equal. And they were subservient from the beginning, and it was just like, oh, great. So basically we're just back to where we were before, just slightly better. And I think it always rubbed in most Welsh people that Scotland got the better deal, and they weren't very happy about it. So that's always been the push-pull of the situation. So getting to this point where they've got a differently named building and everything, and everything's kind of their own and their own method of doing things, I think makes a massive difference on what people view it. And, I appreciate that as well.
Yeah. Any idea of how long it may take you to get from where you are today to concluding with the establishment of the Senate?
My wife, I'll put it this way. My wife bought me a World War II book for Wales, right? And she's like, oh, I can't wait for you to do that. She doesn't listen to the podcast. She's just excited about that section because she bought the book. And I'm like, yeah, maybe in about 3 years, maybe I might get there by then. We're in 1880, 1890 right now. I'm going into World War I. That's going to take at least a year. I assume the interlude between World War I and World War II is going to be another year, and then World War II is going to be a year unto itself because there's so much to talk about in all of those cases. So 5 years, maybe 6, maybe 7. I don't know. It
Yeah.
really depends on kind of where I want to go with it, because one of the biggest things I found is you never know where you're going to dawdle off to.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I wanted to do, so going back to your own podcast
Yes.
/ series,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do something on the establishment of Welsh people in the United States, Canada, Australia,
Right.
and of course Argentina. But I wasn't sure how long it was going to be, whether it was going to be one episode for all of it, or, and I started to do that and I was like, no, this can't be the way it works. There's just too much information, and things happen so differently because, of course, the settlement of Welsh people into Canada and the United States happens way before it does into Argentina and Australia.
Yes.
So you kind of have to feature them when they're happening. So that's kind of where I kind of focused it. Of course, the Americans come first in Pennsylvania, with the eventual moving of people after the Revolutionary War into Canada. That then creates a whole different set of people.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is in Canada is it's never been the same. Like, this is something I try and explain to people. It's like, there's not an ethnic pocket of Welsh people the way there is in other places for other people. Like, the Scottish moved into the eastern part of Canada, and even today there's a province called Nova Scotia, New Scotland.
Right. Sure.
And they still have the Highland Games there, and Gaelic's taught in some of it as a language. None of that happened with Welsh.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the Irish are foundational in Boston, in that area, and in Chicago, and all these other cities. We have them here too, and especially in Newfoundland. But yeah, Wales didn't do that. Most Welsh people were basically just a part of the ensemble of people that moved there from Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And so you didn't have the same enclaves, and it didn't create the same thing. So trying to explain that to people is always difficult because, you can look in the United States and there's definitely enclaves. If you look in Australia, there's definitely enclaves for different reasons, of course. But you look in Canada, it's not the case. So trying to talk about those and having them be one episode was just ridiculous. So I tried to split them up. Canada gets probably the shaft because it's the least talked about, because I'm like, what do I say? Oh, there was a few people here and a few people there, but there wasn't like a mass movement of people the way there was for other places. Like Patagonia, for example, is a whole kettle of fish different. And it's interesting in its own way because there's so much, for all the positivity, there's a lot of backlash there too. And there's a lot of discussion about that comes out, which I think a lot of people are very blind to. Until you start to look into it and you're like, oh, actually there is some conflict here. It's not all just, oh, look at the Welsh people that moved here. Aren't they great? No. There's a big indigenous issue that comes out that I didn't know about going into that. So that was interesting. And I mean, of course, I think the biggest thing that's helped the podcast was COVID, because that really drew people in because they had a lot of time on their hands. And then I think Welcome to Wrexham has been incredibly helpful as well, because people are suddenly interested, and they're not all going, oh, it's the fish, which I heard so frequently before, right? So for me, that's been the big parts of it. And as far as when a cutoff point will be, it'll be when it is. I've often said to people, I said, I might get to the point where I reach that National Assembly foundation and then go back and cover stuff, much like this Roman Britain business, and just revisit stuff that I'm not happy or just didn't get covered enough, or maybe there was a section I didn't know well enough and couldn't go into in depth the way I can now. So all of that means it could be evergreen. I don't think it will be, but I mean, I've always said one of my end goals with this series is to write a book out of it. And that's what I really would like to do in the end. And that's kind of the end goal, but we'll see.
Good.
Yeah.
Before we conclude today, anything that's on your mind that you would like to share with us about Wales or your Welshness or your future with Welsh history, anything that we have not covered yet? The guys from Trigonometry always have the same question at the end of their podcast, and it's something like, what should we have talked about today that we didn't? So I guess I have the same question for you.
Well, I think if people are watching this episode and they're probably interested in Welsh history or Welsh culture, so I think that's a good start. I think that's always a great start, and don't get caught up in I would always say, and I think most Welsh people will agree, if you want to learn the language and you're not confident with it and the pronunciation's difficult, yes, internet people will go on and hardcore on about, oh, you didn't pronounce this right or that right. But reality is that most people are just happy you speak it because the language is so neglected, even to a point in Wales. It's getting better, but I would argue it's still neglected overall. I mean, my kids learned it in school when they went to school.
Right.
There's still a song I remember coming out of one of the kids' schools that I remember because they did a tidy up song, which was all in Welsh. And so I remember that. But like that kind of stuff, I look at it the same way I do about bilingualism in Canada with French, in that it's great, but if nobody uses the language outside of the school, it gets forgotten real fast.
Sure.
And, but I also know that I know enough people who speak Welsh that if you spoke Welsh to them in whatever halting, half English, half Welsh, mangled, blah, 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 they're not going to care. They're going to be so delighted that you speak the language and understand bits and pieces of it. Even if it's just a small amount, even if it's just to say hello, like Shemai in South Wales, or, if you can say Crioiso or happy birthday or any number of different things, if you can just bit and be, a lot of people in Wales think that it's like you either speak it or you don't. And I don't think that's the case. And I think most people fail to understand that trying actually is a great thing. And I would say going to Wales is definitely something you should do. If you have interest, you need to go, because it's very difficult to understand a place that you've never been to.
Sure.
And once you've been to it, I feel like you learn so much about the people and about the place and about all the history that's rolled into it that even they themselves may not appreciate as much as maybe they should. And it's an interesting conversation, I think, every time.
Absolutely. So, Jonathan, how can someone contact you? They can contact you where or how?
Typically, as I say at the end of every one of my episodes, it's like you can contact me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, which is my email, obviously, for the podcast. Typically, I'm on social media at Welsh History Pod. That's Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. I'm on all three of those.
Okay.
And I am on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast, which is the other way that people can get in touch with me.
And you're also on Patreon?
I am on Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. It's the most easy one.
Fantastic. Well, thanks a million for spending some time with us today. And for those of you watching, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or give us a like if you like this kind of information today. If you'd like more podcasts with individuals just like Jonathan, or if you'd like to hear more videos on Welsh American history, we are chronologically going through the history. I am only up to about the American Revolution. So there's a lot more incredible history to come, but step by step, we're moving forward and going to get there. And if you have an individual you would like me to specifically focus on, let us know in the comments below. So, Jonathan, thanks a million for your time today. And for our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Hoyle and Nauer, bye for now.
Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.